Yeah.
Okay, so welcome everybody. So it's a great pleasure to have here with us Roy Dings he's a postdoctoral researcher at Ruhr Universität Bochum, and he's going to present today his work on meaningful affordances that's based on a paper that was recently published in Synthèse. So we have a study group here that we were discussing several issues connected with affordances and the notion of meaningful affordances. So we came up with Roy's paper, and then I remember that I had met Roy briefly when I was in Bochum last year, so I invited him to talk to us about his paper, and I'm really happy that he accepted the invitation. So so as it's just an informal meeting we can be very flexible with time. So Roy, you can just take as much time as you want, and you can decide if you want to be interrupted or if you want to leave questions for later. So I'll leave it up to you.
Okay, thanks. As for the questions, I mean, what I usually do is, if you have a question, just ask it during the talk, and then I will sort of see if it makes sense to answer that directly or whether it makes sense to sort of save that for after the talk. So usually questions for clarification are more suitable to be answered immediately. Yeah, so this is...
Just to tell people that, if you have a question, so please write it on the chat and do not just, speak, leave your microphone muted for now. And if anyone has a clarificatory comment, you can write it on the chat, and then Roy will see it, or I can, see it. Okay, Roy, go ahead.
Great. So what I'll be presenting is the paper on affordances that I published, as well as some sort of thoughts that I've had in these past couple of years, some of which are included in the paper, but some of which are not. And they all have to do with affordances. And given the sort of, topics that your group is interested in, I'm going to assume that you're all familiar with this notion of affordances, that it doesn't really need that much introduction. What I normally would do is, if I would have to introduce it, is I would use this picture that you see here. So this is a man sort of engaging with different affordances of a barrel of sorts. So what does a barrel affords? Well, it affords, kicking and sitting in it and standing on it, etc. And to a large extent, my paper is actually about the fact that when we introduce affordances like this, we always talk about these very trivial cases, like it affords standing on. And if we look at the sort of history of how the concept of affordances was developed, that makes sense, right? So it's developed in the context of visual science, visual cognitive science. And so then the affordance of being able to stand on it is clearly one of the, it's a suitable example. However, what we've seen in the past, I don't know, like let's say 10 years or so, is that people have been using the notion of affordances also in a much broader way. And I think that at that point, it sort of becomes questionable whether this notion is still suitable, whether we might have to sort of revise it in some way. Maybe, according to some people, we should just get rid of it altogether. And that's sort of the context in which I've been thinking about this issue. So what I'll be doing in this paper is or in this presentation, is I will largely follow the outline of the paper that I published, in which I start with this general worry that some people might have about affordances and why that could be a problem. I will then go on to diagnose what I think is the origin of the issue. So what's the reason why this worry can come up? And so the worry is going to be that affordances are not meaningful. And I will, in a third part, walk towards what I think could be an account of meaningful affordances. And so what I do in the paper is I connect this to a discussion about autonomous agency, which I think that for reasons of time I will not discuss here, but if people within your group are interested in it, then we can always discuss that in the discussion afterwards or in the Q&A. So the worry is really quite simple, actually. So it's a worry that has been put forward in this chapter by Matthew Ratcliffe and Matthew Broom. So Matthew Radcliffe is a philosopher, and Matthew Broom is a philosopher as well as a clinical psychologist. And they talk about this notion of affordances as being insufficiently discerning and lacking the required discriminatory power. And I think that this is an issue that Matthew Radcliffe has addressed earlier in his book on depression, where he makes this remark about these attempts of thinking about depression in terms of affordances. But then he says, well, things do not simply afford activities, they appear significant to us in all sorts of ways. It's not helpful to say that a bull affords running away from while a cream cake affords eating. What is needed, he says, are distinctions between the many ways in which things appear significant to us, and in some cases, solicit activity. So I think that this general worry is quite easy to sort of grasp. So the idea is that affordances cannot accommodate this idea that things in the world are experienced as being meaningful. One sort of immediate alternative could be, well, can't we just say that affordances are, like, for instance, relevant or salient? But here the worry seems to emerge as well, because you can say, well, there's different ways in which something can be relevant, there's different ways in which you might experience something as being salient. So in a nutshell, the worry is that there's a diversity in how things matter to someone, right? And saying that something matters is a very, I would say, colloquial way of trying to grasp this, these various instances. And so the notion of an affordance, or so it is suggested, fails to capture this diversity. So at one, to some extent, people could sort of disagree with the assumption here that there is a diversity in how things matter to someone. But as far as I know, everyone sort of seems to agree on that. It just seems to be a fact of life that there is this diversity. So the question is whether we can sort of see to what extent the notion of an affordance is able to accommodate that. So at this point, people might also think, well, didn't Gibson, with this notion of an affordance, actually provide a theory of meaning, right? So this is a very common understanding of Gibson and of a theory of affordances. So we see this in the work of Harry Heft and Ellen Gastal, but also more recently in the book by Manuel Heras Escribano, which you might be familiar with. He also talks about affordances as being, or about Gibson's theory of affordances as being essentially a theory of meaning. And so what I did in a recent commentary to a paper by Heras Escribano, basically papers sort of outlining his book, I hinted at the suggestion that actually Gibson shifted from a very diverse understanding of meaning to a more narrowed one. So here's an extremely coarse-grained overview of what Gibson did. So we see in one of his earlier works, The Perception of the Visual World, that Gibson really does acknowledge these sort of different kinds of meaning. So he talks about affordances, but also about emotional valences, symbols, meanings of events, and social meanings. So he has this quite elaborate discussion of what I would say is this diversity of the way that things in the world could matter to an organism or to an agent. Then in the book after that, The Sentence Considered as Perceptual Systems, he sort of starts to shift already. So he suggests that we can speak of affordances instead of value and meaning. And then affordances at that point is quite basically understood as simply what things furnish for good or ill. Then in what may be the most encompassing work regarding affordances is The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, which is another decade later. And here Gibson speaks about the meaningful world exclusively in terms of ecological information and affordances. So he does not leave any room for subjective values. And then in a bundle of essays, which was published after Gibson died, there's an essay by him in which he actually conflates the two. So the meaning or value of a thing consists in what it affords. So this is, like I said, an extremely coarse-grained analysis, and I don't want to argue that this is, that this is the only interpretation available. But I do think it sort of hints at this idea that, for whatever reason, Gibson did steer towards this more narrowed understanding of what it means for the world to be meaningful, from a very diverse understanding to a more narrowed one in which meaning just simply is the affordance of something. So what I also add is that regardless of what you think of this interpretation, it's really important that contemporary psychology of meaning actually doesn't really discuss Gibson or affordances. So this is a 2013 book which has over 500 pages, and I think something like 23 or 25 chapters by prominent psychologists. And Gibson is, I think, mentioned once or twice, and the notion of affordances is, if I remember correctly, not even mentioned at all. So this really sort of shows that, regardless of what we think about Gibson or what we think about affordances, it's really interesting to see that psychology as a field, that is to say, everything outside of explicit ecological psychology, hasn't really taken up that much of Gibson or affordances. And that even if we think that Gibson has offered a theory of meaning, the fact that a lot of other people disagree with that sort of, shows that there is work to be done regarding this notion of affordances. And so what I said here, for instance, we can see this sort of idea that, or the worry of Radcliffe as a sort of theoretical concern that we have, but of course the fact that that it's actually not picked up by other psychologists is to a large extent, more of a problem than just being a theoretical worry, I would say. Okay. So, the following question I would say is, how does this worry actually lead to a problem? And the idea here is that if the notion of an affordance is indeed not suitable for if this worry is correct, then that would entail that we cannot use the notion of an affordance in investigative contexts which actually make use of or rely on this diversity in how something matters to the agent. I think there's a remark. So I take it that everyone is able to read the question. And the interesting thing is that Matthew Radcliffe, for instance, does not really address the more like ontological status of affordances. There are some other people, for instance, Eric Rietveld and Rob Withage, who have also written about the phenomenology of how we experience affordances, and they typically opt for a more, to some extent, subject-dependent view. So you could distinguish affordances which are independent of a perceiver from solicitations, and solicitations are dependent, to a certain degree at least, to the person who is perceiving them. Because for something to be a solicitation, it has to match or sort of connect with the individual's concerns and skills and abilities. So in that sense, it's more subjective. Although people in general don't really like this distinction between objective and subjective, of course, because that's one of the distinctions that this ecological approach wants to overcome in the first place. So at this point, I don't know if I've addressed the question sufficiently, but otherwise just respond again, or we can save this as a point for discussion later on as well. Okay. So if we would just, for the sake of the argument, agree that this is a worry that we would sort of endorse, then this could be a problem, because that would mean that it's actually not suitable to talk about affordances in the following contexts. So in the paper, I mentioned a few of them. One of them is the context of psychiatry and more generally clinical contexts, which is actually the main context that Matthew Radcliffe seems to be interested in, and is also a context that I've published about. So, but like I said, I'm not going to go into detail about that here. The other context I mentioned is relevant to autonomous and authentic agency. So people like Sanneke Hahn and Sean Gallagher have written about thinking about autonomy and authenticity in terms of experiencing and interacting with affordances. And what I do towards the end of the paper is I sort of try to supplement those accounts by saying, well, it's not affordances per se, but it's meaningful affordances that play a role in autonomy and authenticity. And what most of the paper focuses on, and what I will focus on here, is more generally some developments in cognitive science for which I think that this worry could be a problem. So the main accounts I have in mind here are those which would be inspired by some form of an activism, and I think that the best example of that would be, for instance, the paper by Rietveld and Kiverstein 2014, or more generally their skilled intentionality framework. So what you see there is that so there's two reasons for why they need to account for this diversity and how something matters to the agent. On the one hand, because explaining or accommodating the lived experience of the agent is seen as a benchmark for proper explanation. So if we have two explanations and one of them accounts for the lived experience of the agent, then on an activist account, that's the better explanation. And then secondly, these experiences of how something matters play a functional role within the theoretical framework. So in the skilled intentionality framework, experiences of relevance and salience are, for instance, what steers the agent towards a certain trajectory of actions, for instance. So they have this idea that affordances are nested, and engaging with one affordance might make other affordances more relevant or salient, and so as such more likely to be acted upon, for instance. So we see that both of these things, this benchmark for proper explanation as well as the functional role, require us to be more specific about what we mean when we say that an affordance is relevant or salient, or that it matters to the agent or whatever. But as of yet, Rietveld and Kiverstein don't really elaborate on what that might entail. That is to say, they have some ideas about this. I've talked with them a couple of times. They're actually both in my PhD committee a few years ago, so that's why I know that they do have some thoughts about this, but at least they haven't published that yet. So, so this, to a large extent, I would say this is a problematic state of affairs, because I think that the skilled intentionality framework is one of the most influential frameworks now in research on affordances, and it seems that they are not able to accommodate this worry, although that they should. So if we sort of try to analyze that, how can we sort of see like where did the problem emerge? Where did we go wrong, so to speak, in thinking about affordances? And what I do in the paper is I draw on philosophy of action, basically, to sort of elucidate this. And I was really surprised. So when I wrote this paper, I talked to a couple of people before writing it, because I just thought, the point that I'm making is to some extent quite straightforward and even a bit trivial. So I really expected that someone has already written about this and I just don't know about it yet. But it turns out that people haven't done so. And the reason why I was thinking that people have already written about this is because affordances are typically and quite colloquially described as possibilities for action. But what we know from decades of research in philosophy of action is that it's very difficult to demarcate what an action consists of. So we have, dozens of books and hundreds of articles on philosophy of action. And then we have a field called, focusing on possibilities for action, but that field actually has not really connected with the research on the philosophy of action. And I found that very strange. And to some extent, I hope that this paper also contributes to more connections between those fields, because I think that they can be mutually enriching. Okay, so these are the three steps in the argument, and I'm going to go through these now. So at the very core, I would say, of philosophy of action is what you could call the ambiguity of action. And that's basically that it's really difficult to pinpoint what an action consists of. So this is a quote by Alasdair MacIntyre, 1984. He says, "It's a conceptual commonplace that one and the same segment of human behavior may be correctly characterized in a number of ways. To the question, what is he doing? The answers may with equal truth and appropriateness be digging, gardening, taking exercise, preparing for winter, or pleasing his wife." So there's one and the same behavior. And then we have different possible actions that may be realized with that behavior. So we can make the analogy here with affordances by asking, well, what is it that the gardener experiences when he walks into his garden? Or specifically, what does his garden afford? What action does it solicit? Or what actions are afforded by specific, objects in the garden, for instance? And then what we see in philosophy of action is that people turn to intentions to determine the action at stake. So what action the gardener is actually performing depends on his intentions. So if he intends to prepare the garden for winter, then that's what he's doing. And if he intends to exercise, then that's what he's doing while shoveling or whatever. And interestingly enough, we see the same sort of step being done in ecological psychology. So, or at least, to some extent, because in ecological psychology, there is also a reference being made to intentions to determine what affordance is experienced as being relevant or as mattering. So here's a quote by Harry Heft, saying that a lighted candle not only affords pain if you touch its flame, but more positively, it also affords illuminating a dark place, as well as heating a liquid such as water. Which of these latter two dispositional qualities is realized in experience depends on the individual's behavioral goals or intentions at a particular time. So so far the analogy really seems to sort of work, right? So we have one and the same behavior can be described as various actions, and which action is actually experienced depends on the intention of the agent. And on the affordance side, so to speak, again, we have one and the same object affording different things, and which affordance is actually experienced depends on the individual's intentions. Now, the following step is where the analogy sort of disconnects, in the sense that affordance research seems to have not kept up with philosophy of action. And that's because in philosophy of action, there is this idea that an intention is always embedded in other intentions, as well as short and long-term goals, but also in reasons, values, commitments, preferences, narratives, and so forth. So just like, we cannot say what an action is without making reference to an intention, we cannot understand an intention without making reference to this sort of holistic structure in which the intention is embedded. And that structure consists of different things, depending on different people, but generally people would say that there's these long and short-term goals, reasons, values, you have reasons for why you have a certain goal, etc. And what I emphasize in the paper is that this is not just some sort of addition to the theory, but I think that this is actually needed. We need to acknowledge this, because this embeddedness of intentional actions is what forms the hallmark of human agency. This is, what distinguishes human agency from other organisms and animals interacting with affordances. And human agency has this embeddedness, I think, because of different reasons. So first of all, it's diachronic, right? So when human beings act, in contrast with when many animals act, these actions are diachronic. So we base ourselves explicitly on what we did in the past, and we might anticipate things in the future. And that whole sort of temporal system plays a role in my actions here and now. Secondly, human agency is self-interpretative, right? So there's this famous quote by Charles Taylor, who says that human beings are self-interpretative animals. And I think that that's really crucial, that we reflect on what we do. And as such, we might take an active stance towards our own field of affordances. We might, notice that we are solicited to act in a certain way by our environment, reflect on that, think, this is not what I want, and try to change it. That's actually what happens in a lot of, if you become aware of a bad habit, for instance, and you want to get rid of it. And this self-interpretative nature is, I think, one of the key things that has not been sufficiently addressed in research on affordances. And finally, social, of course, right? So any human behavior is typically also social behavior, or at least culturally embedded. So we have different norms that we adhere to that may guide our actions and so forth. And in contrast to the first 2 points, the social dimension of affordances is actually much more investigated. Okay. So the interesting thing here is that if we look at some research in the past couple of years, really, because this is, I think, really this emerging field. So people like Rob Withagen, for instance, have explicitly written about this idea that our experience of affordances does connect to our diachronic concerns. So you might think, well, we're on the right track then. But I would think that these researchers tend to take what I call an atomistic approach to diachronic concerns. So they do acknowledge that our intentions, etc., are spread over longer timescales, but they don't sufficiently acknowledge the embeddedness of those intentions and how that embeddedness might affect our agential phenomenology. So let me give you an example to make things more concrete about what I mean by this. So let's say that someone's having a barbecue and there is 2 people walking up to the barbecue. And the crucial sort of distinction here is that one of the people is a vegetarian and the other person is not. So then the idea is that if these 2 people, look at the barbecue and they experience the exact same object, it seems, and this is just an intuition, but I think that most people would agree, that the experience of the meat on the barbecue for those people is quite different. They don't experience the same thing, so to speak. And I think that to make sense of that, we need to go beyond what affordance research has done so far. And that is to acknowledge the richness of this agential phenomenology. So an atomistic approach might appreciate that intentions span across multiple timescales, but fail to appreciate that those intentions are always embedded in other concerns or personal characteristics of the agent. So an atomistic approach still ends up with an impoverished notion of relevance, where, for instance, the meat on the barbecue is experienced as merely relevant because of the relevance to the agent's hunger. But of course, this is not what we want to say. It's not that a vegetarian experiences meat as being relevant because they're hungry. They might experience it that way, but that's certainly not the only thing that sort of makes up for that experience. So on a more holistic approach, we would emphasize precisely the embeddedness of any particular concern. So on this holistic view, the agent's concern of being hungry is inextricable from other concerns, as well as personal characteristics like values and self-narratives. So for the vegetarian, the meat on the barbecue is not experienced as merely relevant, but comes with a much richer phenomenology because of this embeddedness of the concern of hunger with things like social commitments, a cherished self-image, etc. Okay, so this is basically repeating what I just said. So we can only understand the meaningfulness of affordances if we take into account this holistic diachronicity So if you take into account the fact that any intention or goal to which an affordance is relevant is embedded in things like the agent's values, commitments, and self-narratives. And I talk about this in the paper quite sort of generally, because I think that more work has to be done to sort of, delineate the exact role of, for instance, the agent's values. The argument here is just that we should take that into account, not what precise role that it plays. So the point here is that most of the existing work on affordances implicitly adopts this atomistic view. And this is why they rely on a simplified notion of experience relevance, and are thus prone to the criticism that affordances are insufficient to capture what matters. So this is basically the argument, or sort of the result of my analysis of why existing research is prone to this worry, to this criticism. And now the question is, can we come up with an alternative, a different way of looking at affordances in such a way that it actually accommodates this diversity and how things matter to the agent? And here the argument has two steps, basically. So first, I'm going to draw on some existing research that shows that people have a sense of what they're doing. And I'm going to make the analogy that people also have a sense of what is afforded. And the research I draw on is called action identification theory. So this is a theory from which was developed originally in the 1980s, but it has been further developed and applied in various contexts since then. So this is Robin Velliker and Daniel Wegner. And what they do is they develop this theory based on this idea that when people are acting on the environment, they have a sense of what they're doing. And what they think that they're doing modulates their agency. So what you think you're doing makes a difference for how you're doing it, in the sense of how conscious you are of what you're doing, how fluid your actions are, how flexible, etc. So if we take again the example of the gardener that we had earlier, is the gardener digging or preparing the garden for winter? Velliker and Wagner would say that these are different action identities, and they're organized hierarchically, they would say. So on the one hand, we have lower level identities, which convey the details or specifics of the action and thus indicate how the action is performed. We have higher level identities, which provide a more general understanding of the action. So they indicate why the action is performed and what its effects and implications are. So higher level identities are less movement defined than lower level identities and provide a more abstract and comprehensive understanding of the action. Was there a question? I think so. Okay, so a question about whether my view can be met with an activism. I think so, but let's discuss that later indeed, as you suggest. Okay, so here's a way of sort of visualizing what's at stake. So here in blue, so A, B, and C are different action identities. So you can say that someone is bending down and picking up trash from the ground, but you could also say that that person is cleaning the street. You could also say that that person is contributing to society. And what we see here is the sort of structural relations between these different action identities, right? So you would bend down and pick up trash from the ground in order to clean the street, in order to contribute to society, or conversely, you would contribute to society by cleaning the street, by bending down and picking up trash from the ground. I think this is very sort of intuitive how this works. And then towards the left, we have low-level actions. Towards the right, we have high-level actions. And of course, this is relative, right? So B is high-level relative to A, but it's low-level relative to C. And then the idea is that the more we go to the low-level actions, the more we're specifying the details and movements of an action. So we're basically answering the how question. And the more we go to the right, so the more we go to the high-level actions, the more we're abstracting from the concrete situation, the more we're providing reasons and embedding that that action. In other words, we're answering the why question. Why is someone doing this? So what we then see in action identification theory is that they further develop this, and they offer three principles. So the first one is that people always identify their actions, and they don't do that consciously, which is an important point, and I'll return to that later. But the idea is that everyone has a sense of what they're doing. So it's unable to do something without identifying what you're doing, basically. And then this is crucial. When there's two or more plausible identities available, people are inclined to choose the identity that provides the most comprehensive understanding of what they're doing, plan to do, or have done. So yeah, I'll come back to that in a second. And then when an action is complex, unfamiliar, time-consuming, or being disrupted, agents tend to shift towards a lower-level identity. And this is something that they've studied quite extensively in different ways. So they did questionnaire studies, for instance, as well as just a more ecologically valid experimental conditions. And this is really a confirmed finding. So what this means is, if we come back to this schedule, it means that when people are, so what the gardener is doing is, it's very unlikely that he has digging as the action identity that guides his action. It's more likely that he has this one or this one, because preparing the garden for winter is a more comprehensive understanding of what he's doing, right? And so what we see, so there's some interesting studies that they've also done on development of expertise, for instance. And what you see is that if you are an expert, so let's say that we are all expert academics and we're writing papers. Writing an academic paper is a relatively high-level description of what we are doing. A much more low-level description is like hitting the keyboard. That would be, the same description of writing a paper, but much more low-level. Or like tying a shoelace. That's a high-level description of holding the shoelaces in a certain way, moving them in a certain way, etc. And so basically, if you adopt an action identity that is like too low, so to speak, that is actually disruptive for action. So if you are actually able to fluently type on a keyboard, and then one of the keys on the keyboard is actually not working properly, you're basically forced to pay attention to the key that's not working. So you're forced to shift from this high-level idea of typing a paper to a more low-level description of investigating what's wrong with the key. Yeah, I might be going a bit off track here, but I hope the general idea is clear, and if not, then we can discuss that further later on. So what we have so far is this empirically substantiated intuition that people have a sense of what is of what they're doing, and my suggestion is basically that they also have a sense of what is afforded. So what we have is meaningful affordances, being those affordances that are experienced with a relatively high level identity, which show how the particular action that one is invited to carry out is embedded in and inextricable from the diachronic concerns of the agent. And so phenomenologically, that means that the action is experienced as being purposive. So you actually have a sort of direction in the action. You're going in a certain way. The action is also carried out flexibly and fluidly, so you're able to sort of carry out that action without any major deviations from your action plan. And finally, there is an important sense in which it's you that is acting. So there is a sense of authentic agency, or more generally, a substantial sense of agency that's associated with carrying out the action. So here's some examples of meaningful affordances. So let's say that the piece of plastic being experienced as not affording picking up, that would be a relatively low level action identity. But if you experience the piece of plastic on the ground as affording a good deed, that's a relatively high level action identity. So if the garden could be experienced as affording digging, but you could also experience it as affording me to make my wife happy. And in the latter case, it's a meaningful affordance because it has a high level identity. And so the meat on the barbecue can be experienced as affording eating, again, low level identity, but you could also experience it as affording to start a lecture on animal cruelty, and that would be a relatively high level. So if you connect this to the criticism on existing research on affordance, it's basically that most of affordance research has been focusing on low-level action identities. So they've been focusing on trivial things, trivial actions that objects afford, but objects also afford these more meaningful actions. And in fact, as the research on action identification shows, typical human everyday behavior consists of high-level action identities and not of low-level action identities. So this is why we need the high-level identities to make sense of human agency. So in the commentary to Heras Escribano, I wrote, the question was, can ecological psychology account for human agency and meaningful experience? And the idea here is that human agency is actions that have high-level action identities. And so far, ecological psychology, therefore, has not been able to accommodate human agency. Now, what's crucial, I think, and this is the last part of the talk, is that people might have a worry that there is a sort of Cartesianism on the lure. And in the paper, I elaborate on this more extensively because the action identification theory that I rely on is that's clearly a Cartesian theory in the sense that they talk about mental control. So they think that it's, conscious representations of an action informing an action, etc. And of course, that's precisely what ecological psychology wants to get rid of. So then people might think that there is a sort of Cartesian picture that I'm painting. But I don't think that that's the case, and I don't think it's the case because the only thing that I'm really taking from, well, I'm taking two things from action identification theory, and one of them is the terminology. So the terminology of low-level and high-level action identities, and I mean that's just semantics, right? So how you describe an action says nothing about the underlying cognitive mechanisms. So I don't think that that's an issue. The other thing that could be a more substantial issue is this idea that we identify actions. And then the worry could be that acts of identification could be seen as these conscious or mental acts. And in that sense, they could be at odds with the typical picture of ecological psychology. However, I don't think that we need to have that kind of interpretation because I think that a sort of ecologically friendly alternative is also available. And I think that's the case because of two things. I think first, because much of our agency is context-driven. So here we actually have an interesting analogy again. So action identification theory makes this point, but affordance research makes this point as well. So action identification theory says that how we identify an action depends on the context that we're engaged in. So let's say that you've previously, so I gave the example in the paper of picking up a piece of plastic on the ground. And if you experience that as affording a good deed, then it's likely that other objects in your environment that also afford performing a good deed are experienced as such. So if you see an elderly person wanting to cross the street, then you could help them doing that as well. But if you experience a soda can on the ground as expending your collection of soda cans, then you would probably not necessarily experience the elderly person wanting to cross the street as affording a contribution to society. And we have the similar idea in affordance research. So Lutger van Dijk and Eric Rietveld have this paper on the nestedness of affordances that I previously alluded to as well. So they similarly say that affordances are all connected in a contextually way. So it's likely that if you interact with one affordance in a context, that the other affordances in that context become more easily soliciting. So this idea of being context-driven already indicates that we can talk about identification in a way that is ecologically friendly, so to speak. And the other one could be more controversial, but I think it's, you know, it's something that I've described in an earlier paper I wrote as well, and I really still agree with what I said then, which is that an identification sort of flows from who we are. And this is a bit metaphorical, but let me say what I mean by this. So we have this famous phrase by Gibson, who says that to perceive the world is to co-perceive oneself, right? And this is central to the ecological project and to the theory of affordances. But the way that that's typically understood is only in embodied terms. So then to perceive a chair is to at the same time perceive, you know, my own bodily configuration, my bodily skills, the sort of capacities that I have. And because I co-perceive my body, I'm able to experience the affordance, right? So I experience the object, so the world, as well as myself, and jointly that constitutes an experience of an affordance. Now, the sort of crucial step is to say, well, you don't only co-perceive embodiment, but you co-perceive other aspects of yourself as well. So I've argued in favor of this sort of broader idea of self-referentiality, where it's not only embodiment that is co-perceived, but also things like values, commitments, and narratives. So here's the conclusion. In traditional Gibsonian ecological psychology, people would argue that if your body would be different, then you would experience the world differently. Specifically, you would experience the affordances of, you know, different objects differently. And this is something that everyone seems to agree on. This is actually something that Gibson himself would say. But the current proposal would argue that there's a broadened self-referentiality. So again, if my values or social roles, long-term goals, etc., if those were different, then I would also experience the world differently. I would also experience what the world affords differently. And what would be different is whether an affordance is experienced as relevant and how it's experienced as relevant. So the meaningfulness of those affordances, the way that they're inextricable from my diachronic concerns, that is to say, the identification at a much more higher level, that's what would be different in my experience of the world in that regard. So that was the presentation so far. So this was, like I said, one of the papers in Synthese, and I want to thank these people who collaborated on me with that, or at least give me feedback on some of the earlier versions of that paper, and have helped me to make the paper into what it is now. Should I stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.